You're a priest in the year 1396, standing in the cold, echoing halls of Westminster Abbey. The air is crisp with autumn chill, and your breath forms faint clouds as you hold your prayer book close. Around you, servants hurry to and fro, setting everything in place. There's a buzz of excitement. Whispers among the courtiers suggest this will be one of the strangest royal weddings England has ever seen. The bride has just arrived from France, a princess no less, rumored to be the daughter of King Charles himself. Over the years, you've presided over many weddings, joined plenty of noble couples in holy union, but this one is unlike any you've encountered. When the grand oak doors open and the wedding procession steps inside, you feel your eyes widen in shock. The groom, King Richard II, is 29 years old. He looks every bit the monarch, tall, graceful, and commanding. His golden hair glows under the light, filtering through the stained glass windows. Walking beside him is a child, so small she barely reaches his elbow. Her little hand disappears into his gloved palm. She can't be more than 6 or 7 years old. Dressed in an ornate French gown, her dark hair is woven with heavy pearls that seem to weigh down her tiny head. You grip the edge of the altar rail for balance. This is Isabella of Valois, the new Queen of England. You've seen young brides before, 12, 13, marriages arranged for alliances, power, and survival. It's part of noble life. You know the world you live in. Life is fragile and short. Just 50 years ago, the plague wiped out half the people in the kingdom. Kings don't have the luxury of time. They must form bonds while they can. And marriage is still the strongest way to tie nations together. As the ceremony begins, your eyes drift to the young princess. She doesn't look afraid. She looks curious, her big dark eyes wandering over the high Gothic arches, the dancing candlelight, the nobles in rich silks and deep velvets. Everything around her is grand and overwhelming, but she takes it in with quiet wonder. When King Richard says his vows, his voice is calm and soft, even kind. He's not some cruel man forcing himself on a child. He's a king doing his duty, trying to bring peace with France through the bond of marriage. Everyone understands the terms. The marriage won't be consummated. She's too young. And that is clear to all. The plan is for her to be raised here, educated in the English court, and prepared for her role as queen when she grows older. This is simply how things are done. You bless their union in a calm, steady voice, even though something in your chest feels off as you say the words that make them husband and wife. As you watch this tiny girl take her place as Queen of England, a quiet worry settles in your heart. What kind of future could she possibly face in the cutthroat world of royal politics? Before we go deeper into these overlooked stories of survival and suffering, take a moment, if you're interested in uncovering hidden corners of history. Please hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It amazes me that we're exploring these long-forgotten moments from different corners of the world, linked together across time and distance by our shared curiosity about the past. The marriage of Isabella of Valois to King Richard II was never meant to be a romance. It was a calculated act of medieval diplomacy. She was a young piece in a much larger game, moved to bring an end to one of the most destructive wars in Europe's history, the 100 Years' War. To truly understand Isabella's fate, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the world she was born into, and the powerful forces that would shape her short, tragic life. Isabella was born on November 9th, 1389, in the Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the eldest daughter of one of the most troubled rulers of the medieval era, King Charles VI of France. Her father was known to history as Charles the Mad, and not without reason. He suffered from terrifying episodes of insanity, which surely cast long shadows over Isabella's childhood. At times, Charles ruled effectively and made sound decisions, but during his darker periods, he would lose touch with reality, forget who he was, claim he was made of glass, or go months without bathing. These were not quiet spells of illness. They were full breakdowns that would bring chaos and fear to the royal household. Just imagine young Isabella growing up in such a grand yet unstable environment. One day, her father might lift her onto his knee, laughing and giving her gifts. The next, she might see him crouched in a corner, screaming about invisible assassins, or standing frozen for hours, afraid that if he so much as moved, his fragile glass body would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Whenever her father suffered one of his episodes, the palace staff would quietly rush the children out of sight. But even with the chaos hidden away, the fear stayed with young Isabella. You could see it in her eyes. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was a strong-willed woman who tried to keep the kingdom functioning during her husband's frequent breakdowns. Graceful, intelligent, and politically sharp, Isabeau knew exactly how fragile the situation was. She also understood that her children, especially Isabella, were powerful tools in the dangerous game of royal alliances. Isabeau watched her oldest daughter carefully. She knew Isabella's royal blood and youthful beauty could one day secure a critical diplomatic victory for France. The world Isabella was born into was steeped in constant warfare. For nearly 60 years, England and France had been locked in the bloody, grinding conflict, now known as the 100 Years' War. It had started as a fight over who had the right to the French throne, but over time, it had become something bigger, a battle over identity, wealth, and control of Europe itself. It had swallowed entire generations. By the late 1300s, French villages had been burned to the ground in English raids. English lords had drained their estates to fund endless military campaigns across the sea. Both kingdoms were suffering. Their gold was gone, their armies tired, and their people desperate for peace. By the 1390s, whispers of a possible truce, and that's where 6-year-old Isabella became the centerpiece of a high-stakes diplomatic plan. The idea of marrying Isabella to King Richard II came up during secret talks between French and English diplomats in 1395. Richard had been deeply affected by the loss of his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, who had died the year before. Known as Good Queen Anne, she had won the hearts of the English people with her kindness and compassion. Her death from the plague devastated Richard. He was heartbroken and now also faced a serious political problem. He had no heir. For a medieval king, being childless was dangerous. Without a successor, the crown and the kingdom could fall into chaos. Richard's advisors knew this, and they pushed him to remarry quickly. But at first, the king resisted. He was still grieving and not ready to think about another marriage. Richard's marriage to Anne of Bohemia had been built on genuine love, something rarely seen in royal unions. The idea of marrying someone else felt like betraying her memory. But in the end, his responsibility to the kingdom took priority over his personal grief. And when the French ambassadors arrived with a bold proposal, one that could bring the war to an end, Richard began to take interest. The French offer was nothing short of remarkable. They didn't just propose the hand of the king's eldest daughter. They also promised a dowry of 800,000 francs, a staggering amount of money that could help refill England's war-drained treasury. But even more valuable was their offer of a 28-year truce, long enough for an entire generation to grow up without war hanging over their heads. There was, however, a major issue. Isabella was only 6 years old. Even in the medieval world, where girls were often married off young, this was considered unusually early. Most political brides were at least in their teens or nearing puberty. But the French negotiators made the case that Isabella's youth was, in fact, a strength. She was untouched by the conflict. Her innocence would symbolize a fresh start, a break from the bloodshed and hatred that had poisoned relations between England and France for decades. The plan was for Isabella to be raised in England, surrounded by English customs and traditions. By the time she reached maturity and officially became queen consort, she would feel as English as she was French. Richard's advisors were split. Some saw clear benefits. The massive dowry would support the royal household for years. The long truce would give England breathing room to deal with other growing problems like Scotland's rising threat and the rebellions in Ireland. But others were deeply uneasy. A bride so young, even by royal standards, risked causing scandal. There was concern that such a move might look desperate or even immoral, raising eyebrows not just among commoners, but also within the nobility itself. Still, Richard seemed interested for reasons beyond politics. Courtiers later whispered that when the king was shown a miniature painting of young Isabella sent by the French envoys, his expression changed. There was something in his eyes, they said, that softened, something personal. Here was a child who would need protection, guidance, and care. Some even whispered that the childless king saw this arrangement not just as a diplomatic deal, but as a chance to be something more, a father, not just a husband. The negotiations dragged on for months. Ambassadors made repeated trips across the English Channel, ironing out every small detail. Nothing about Isabella's future was left to chance. They discussed where she would live, who would care for her, and how she would be treated at the English court. She would be allowed to bring her French servants and ladies in waiting. She could continue observing French customs, and she would be free to exchange letters with her family back home. Most importantly, all sides agreed on one thing. The marriage would not be consummated until Isabella reached full physical maturity. This protection was written clearly and officially into the treaty, a firm condition that everyone accepted. Back in Paris, little Isabella, just 6 years old, continued playing with her dolls, completely unaware that her future was being mapped out in meeting rooms and written down in scrolls. This version of the wedding was private, with only high-ranking nobles and key negotiators in attendance. Because Calais was English land in France, it served as a kind of neutral ground, perfect for this unique political event. Inside the great hall of Calais Castle, young Isabella must have felt completely overwhelmed. She wore a gown made of cloth of gold, so heavily decorated with pearls and embroidery that she needed help just to walk. When the time came to exchange rings, King Richard II knelt down to her level. Witnesses remembered how gently he lifted her chin when she looked frightened by the sea of nobles watching her. A year later, she was officially crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. By then, stories of the young French bride had spread throughout the kingdom, and the English people were eager to see her in person. During the coronation ceremony, the crowds in London were so enormous that several people were reportedly crushed to death trying to catch a glimpse of the famous child queen. The coronation ceremony was nothing short of spectacular. Every detail was carefully planned to impress both the English nobility and foreign envoys. This unusual marriage was to be seen as fully supported by the English crown. Isabella made her way through the streets of London in a beautifully decorated litter, adorned with English roses and French fleurs-de-lis, symbols of the union between the two kingdoms. On her small head rested a specially crafted crown, and the long train of her gown was carried by English duchesses, handpicked to serve as her guardians and mentors. The streets were packed with people calling out blessings in English, words she was only just beginning to understand. Still, she smiled and waved gracefully, just as she had been taught. After the coronation, a grand 3-day feast followed. The celebrations included jugglers, musicians, and elaborate stage performances, all meant to portray the bright future this marriage promised for England and France. At the high table, Isabella sat beside King Richard, carefully picking at her meal with the perfect manners her French tutors had instilled in her. Around them, nobles raised their cups and toasted to the health and happiness of the young queen. But while the mood was festive, those who had served in court for many years were already wondering how long this peace would truly last. In the medieval world, even the most carefully crafted truces were fragile. Richard II, though powerful at the moment, was not without critics. Some nobles were quietly grumbling, accusing him of being too influenced by his inner circle of favorites. Others believed he had been too quick to make peace with France, especially when they felt England still had the upper hand militarily. See now, though, Isabella was safe in her new home. Richard gave her private apartments at Westminster Palace, and a special household was assembled to care for her, a mix of French and English attendants, carefully selected to provide balance. Her days were filled with lessons, not just in languages and music, but in the often rigid etiquette of English court life. She learned to curtsy the English way, to choose wine over ale at meals, and to speak English with the polished accent used at court, rather than the tones of her French upbringing. Richard took a personal interest in her well-being and education. Chroniclers from the time describe him visiting her rooms often, bringing gifts from all corners of his kingdom. Exotic birds from Ireland, beautiful books from Oxford, and musical instruments handcrafted by some of London's finest artisans. Richard seemed to truly enjoy spending time with Isabella, and over time, she began to look forward to his visits. She greeted him with a mix of respect and warmth, an unusual blend of formality and affection that reflected their unique bond. The other children at court quickly accepted Isabella as one of their own. In most medieval royal households, it was common for young nobles to be raised alongside the king's family, learning court customs and forging early alliances. Isabella found real companionship among the daughters of Richard's supporters, girls close to her age who helped her understand the quiet rules and hidden layers of English noble society. Her closest friend was Margaret Holland, the daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was only 2 years older, but to Isabella, she seemed confident and experienced, almost like an older sister. Margaret taught Isabella English children's games, showed her which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted, and even warned her about the subtle political tensions that lingered, even in the world of children. The two girls spent long hours together in Isabella's private garden, working on their needlework, while Margaret explained the family histories of noble English houses and the ancient grudges that still simmered beneath the surface of court manners. Isabella learned quickly. Her perspective as an outsider gave her insights that even her older companions found surprising. One day, she asked Margaret, "Why do the English nobles watch each other so closely? In France, there are arguments and rivalries too, but here, it feels like everyone is waiting for something to happen." Margaret, wise beyond her years, explained it simply. Richard's reign had been troubled from the start. A major rebellion had taken place when he was still a teenager, and he had never fully forgiven those who turned against him. Many powerful lords believed he relied too heavily on his inner circle of favorites, ignoring the advice of seasoned nobles when it came to war, taxes, and law. "The king has power now," Margaret said. "But in England, power must be shared with the nobles. Your marriage helps him because it brings peace with France. But some believe it shows weakness. They think he prefers talking over fighting." Isabella took in these lessons with quiet seriousness. She was beginning to realize that her role as queen was not just ceremonial. She was now part of a world ruled by alliances, power plays, and hidden agendas. She began observing court life with new awareness. She noticed how conversations would pause when Richard entered a room, how people changed their tone when she appeared. Even her own French ladies-in-waiting seemed to speak more carefully when discussing political matters. The years 1397 and 1398 passed calmly for Isabella. She matured from a tiny girl into a more confident young lady. Her English became fluent, and her understanding of court life grew sharper. Richard continued to treat her with kindness, almost like a protective father, and she began to feel truly at home in England. The thick, towering stone walls of Westminster Palace, which once seemed so cold and overwhelming, now felt familiar. She could walk the twisting halls without getting lost and navigate court events with quiet confidence. Her education also grew more advanced. Richard made sure she learned to read and write in both French and English, and she studied not just music and embroidery, but history, especially the lives of past English and French kings. Her tutors, some of the best minds in the country, helped her understand the stories and legacies that had shaped the very world she was now living in. The Tower of London loomed in the darkness as Isabella arrived, its high stone walls and torchlit gates cold and unwelcoming. She had seen the tower before, but only from a distance. Now, approaching its gates under the cover of night, surrounded by anxious adults and armored guards, she realized this was not simply another royal residence. This was a place where kings held their enemies and sometimes their own family. Inside, her apartments were modest compared to Westminster, but still comfortable. Her familiar attendants did their best to make the rooms feel safe, unpacking what few belongings they had brought and lighting extra candles to chase away the gloom. But no one could entirely mask the fear that hung in the air. Isabella was not told much. Her French ladies whispered about politics, rebellion, and betrayal, but no one dared say anything directly. From what she could piece together, King Richard had left London, either to confront his cousin Henry or to seek support elsewhere. The waiting was the hardest part. Days passed in tense silence. Soldiers came and went through the tower's gates, but no one brought news. Margaret Holland tried to keep Isabella occupied with stories, lessons, and needlework, but even she seemed distracted, often staring into space or stopping mid-sentence as if listening for footsteps. Then, one evening in August 1399, the truth finally came. A group of royal messengers arrived at the tower. The news spread through the tower quickly. That night, the guards doubled at the gates. Her household was given strict orders not to leave their quarters. Servants whispered that Henry Bolingbroke would be crowned soon as King Henry IV. For Isabella, the change was more than political. It was personal. Her husband was no longer king, and she, the Queen of England, was now a queen without a court, without a crown, and possibly without a future. But there was no time to mourn. With Richard imprisoned, Isabella's position became dangerously uncertain. She was still the daughter of the King of France, and no one knew what Henry IV intended to do with her. Would she be kept in England? Sent back across the Channel? Held as a bargaining chip? The uncertainty hung heavy in the air. Even at such a young age, Isabella understood that everything she had come to know, her life, her friendships, her role, was now in question. Instead of the formal processions she had grown used to, Isabella now traveled under heavy guard. Her litter was part of a small, tightly controlled convoy, with armed men riding ahead and behind. The curtains stayed closed, but from inside she could hear the city. Not the normal buzz of merchants, carts, and town criers, but something harsher, louder, more tense, shouting, boots, metal. When she arrived at the Tower of London, she was placed in a set of private rooms, comfortable, yes, but clearly meant to contain rather than welcome. Bars covered the windows, and guards were posted at every doorway. Her French ladies-in-waiting were allowed to stay by her side, but most of her English attendants were quietly dismissed. For the first time since setting foot in England, Isabella felt completely alone. On her second day in the Tower, Richard came to visit her. The change in him was startling. Gone was the confident, gentle king she had known. In his place stood a man who looked like he had aged years in just a few weeks. His royal robes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes, once warm and watchful, now looked haunted, wild. It reminded Isabella too much of the frightening episodes she'd seen in her father, Charles VI of France. "My dear child," Richard said, kneeling at her chair, just like he had when they first met. "Things have changed. Our situation is difficult. There are men who question my right to rule. They want to destroy the peace we worked so hard to build with your father's kingdom. Isabella was 9 years old now, no longer the innocent girl she'd been at 6. She had grown into a poised, intelligent child, far more aware of politics and power than most adults assumed. "Are you still king?" she asked him directly. Richard gave a bitter half-smile. "For now, but Henry Bolingbroke has many supporters. I may no longer be able to protect you as I once could." What followed was a conversation unlike any they'd ever had. For the first time, Richard didn't speak to her as a child. He treated her as someone who needed to understand the stakes, someone with a role to play in what was unfolding. He explained everything. Henry had returned with an army. The nobles were abandoning Richard one by one. The entire future of England and the fragile peace with France was suddenly uncertain. "What will happen to me?" Isabella asked, her voice steady, remarkably calm for a girl her age. "I don't know," Richard said quietly. His face showed the pain of not having answers. "Henry might try to use you as a bargaining chip with your father, or he might respect our marriage and continue to protect you. It all depends on whether he values peace with France more than his own ambitions." This was Isabella's first real encounter with the cold reality of medieval politics. Her worth wasn't based on who she was, but on what she represented. Her life, her safety, even her future, none of it was hers to control. What mattered most now was how useful she was as a symbol in someone else's political game. The love Richard had shown her was real, but even that couldn't protect her now. The weeks that followed were filled with silence and fear. She could hear the sounds of the city rising from beyond the tower walls, sometimes cheering, sometimes shouting, but no one would tell her what was happening. Real news never reached her chambers. She was caught between kings, uncertain of which one would decide her fate. Her French ladies-in-waiting whispered among themselves in their native tongue, but even they seemed to know little beyond fragmented rumors and quiet speculation. No one could say for certain what was coming, only that something was. Then, on a cold and gray morning in October, Isabella heard the sound she had feared for weeks, the heavy footfalls of armed men approaching her chambers. The noise echoed through the stone hallway, growing louder with each step. When the doors opened, she immediately noticed the difference. These were not the familiar guards who had watched over her in the tower. They wore different uniforms, bearing the red rose insignia of Henry Bolingbroke. And then he appeared. The man who entered the room behind them was tall, commanding, with the posture of a soldier and the sharp, measured eyes of a strategist. This was Henry himself, now King Henry IV of England, coming to meet the young girl who represented both a potential asset and a delicate challenge to his new reign. Isabella stood up from her chair and gave a deep curtsy, just as she had been trained to do when meeting a sovereign. Henry studied her in silence. She could feel his gaze weighing her presence, her manners, the intelligence in her eyes. Perhaps he was already thinking through how best to use her. She was, after all, not just a child, but a French princess, a crowned queen, and a symbol of the peace treaty he had just overturned. "Your Grace," he said formally. Isabella took note. He had addressed her with her royal title, which meant he was being careful, respectful, at least for now. "I regret that we must speak of your future under such circumstances," he continued. Isabella, ever direct, didn't hesitate. "What has become of the king?" she asked plainly, referring, of course, to Richard. Henry's response was clipped. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," he said, deliberately using Richard's birth name, not his royal one. "He has abdicated in favor of my claim to the throne." Isabella, though only 9 years old, had learned enough about the language of power to understand what that meant. Abdicated was a polite word. It most likely meant forced out. Still, she didn't argue. She knew that truth and diplomacy didn't always speak the same language. Instead, she asked the question that truly mattered, her voice calm but firm. "What becomes of me?" This was the moment. Henry's answer would define her fate. Would she remain a queen in name, treated with honor and care? Or would she become a pawn in someone else's game? A valuable prisoner to be used for leverage in negotiations with France. She waited in silence, knowing that whatever came next would shape the rest of her young life. Isabella's future now rested on Henry IV's judgment, specifically how he chose to handle the fragile peace with France. Would he honor the treaty that had been sealed through her marriage, or risk reigniting war to pursue other political goals? "That," Henry said, "will depend on many things. Your father's reaction to recent events, the counsel I receive from my advisors, and," he added, looking directly at her, "your own conduct in the months ahead." With those words, 9-year-old Isabella entered the most dangerous phase of her young life. The protective world she had known under King Richard had vanished. In its place stood the stark, shifting landscape of a kingdom caught in political upheaval. Isabella was no longer simply a child queen being groomed for ceremonial duties. She had become something far more precarious, a political hostage whose personal fate could be weighed against the costs of war or peace. The weeks that followed Richard's deposition became an unexpected education for her. Though still housed within the Tower of London, she wasn't officially labeled a prisoner, but she was very clearly being watched. The court around her was uncertain, unsettled, still debating what exactly should be done with her. Some of Henry's supporters pushed for a quick solution: send Isabella back to France. It would save money on her care, they argued, and signal to the French that England was, as long as the daughter of King Charles VI of France remained in their custody, her father would think twice before making any move that might put her in danger. This group recommended that she remain in comfort, but under quiet surveillance, watched closely, with her every word and gesture noted. And Isabella, remarkably, seemed to understand the stakes. She played her part with impressive composure for a girl of her age. She was always respectful, always polite, especially in front of the new officials assigned to monitor her. She never raised her voice, never questioned orders, and never gave anyone reason to accuse her of rebellion or deceit. She didn't sulk or protest. She didn't plead. She adapted. She understood, perhaps more clearly than many adults, that her survival depended not on rank or title, but on her ability to stay useful, stay calm, and stay out of the way. Despite her captivity, Isabella held firmly to her dignity. She would not allow herself to be treated as anything less than what she legally still was, the Queen of England. Even though the world around her had changed, she refused to forget who she was or let anyone else forget it either. Her French ladies-in-waiting became a crucial source of support during this uncertain time. Unlike her English attendants, many of whom had either been dismissed or disappeared when the power shifted, these women remained loyal, not to any political side, but to Isabella herself. They had come from France with her, and they stayed. They helped her make sense of what was happening, coached her on how to carry herself, what to say, what not to say. Theirs was quiet but strategic guidance, born of experience and wisdom. One woman in particular, her chief lady-in-waiting, Madame Ducey, became a steady voice of reason. "Remember who you are," Madame Ducey told her one evening. "You are still Queen of England, by law and in the eyes of your father's court. Henry may wear the crown now, but he hasn't dared to annul your marriage or formally break the treaty with France. As long as that remains true, you still hold value, and where there is value, there is hope." Those words gave Isabella strength, but the hope they offered came at a cost she was only beginning to understand. Rumors began to reach her rooms in the tower. Quiet, unsettling whispers about Richard's fate. At first, it was said that he had died while being held at Pontefract Castle. Then came darker talk, that his death had not been due to illness or misfortune, but had been arranged. That someone loyal to Henry IV had made sure the former king would never threaten the new regime again. When confirmation finally reached Isabella that Richard was dead, it hit her harder than she expected. She had never loved him, not the way a wife loves a husband. She was a child, and he had been a grown man, a king. But he had been kind. He had treated her gently, protected her, taught her. In a strange land, far from her family, Richard had become the closest thing to a father figure she had known. His death wasn't just a personal loss. It was the end of everything she had managed to build for herself in England. The one man who had sheltered her was gone. The foundation beneath her feet had crumbled, and the way he died, quietly, without trial or fanfare, likely at the hands of his political enemies, sent a chilling message. If that could happen to a king, what did it mean for a queen with no power? Isabella now understood what few 9-year-olds ever did. In this world of crowns and swords, alliances and betrayals, no one was truly safe, not even royalty. Through it all, Isabella refused to let go of the dignity that came with her title. No matter what others might say or do, she carried herself as Queen of England, because in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of her father's court, that's exactly what she still was. Her French ladies-in-waiting were essential during this uncertain time. Unlike her English attendants, who had either been dismissed or disappeared when the crown changed hands, these women remained loyal, not to any English faction, but to Isabella herself. They weren't caught up in court politics. They were there for her. They helped her understand the delicate position she was now in, and they guided her in how to carry herself, how to find the right balance between caution and confidence, submission and pride. Her chief lady-in-waiting, Madame Ducey, offered words that would stay with Isabella for a long time. "Remember," Madame Ducey said gently but firmly, "you are still Queen of England, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of your father's court. Henry may wear the crown, but he hasn't dared to break your marriage or reject the treaty. As long as that remains true, you are valuable, and where there is value, there is hope." But that hope came with a price, a painful one Isabella was only just starting to grasp. Whispers about Richard's fate began to make their way into the tower. First came vague reports that he had died in captivity at Pontefract Castle. Then more troubling rumors followed. Rumors suggesting that his death was no accident, and that men loyal to Henry IV had arranged for it to happen quietly. When the truth finally reached Isabella, that Richard was dead, The impact was deeper than she had expected. She had never loved him the way a wife might love a husband. How could she? She was still a child. But Richard had been gentle with her, protective, even warm. In many ways, he had become the closest thing she'd had to a father figure since she'd left France. His death wasn't just sad. It felt like the final break with everything she had managed to hold on to in England. The life she had known was gone. And it wasn't just the loss that shook her. It was the way he had died. No trial, no explanation, no justice, just silence. If a former king could be disposed of so easily, what might happen to a foreign-born child queen who had no real power and no protector? For the first time, Isabella began to fully understand the danger she was in. If Henry was truly capable of orchestrating the quiet removal of a crowned and anointed king, what reason would he have to spare a young French princess, especially one who had already served her political purpose? It was a terrifying thought, and one that soon proved justified. In early 1400, Isabella received a formal message from Henry's government. It was an ultimatum, carefully worded and impossible to ignore. She would be allowed to return to France, but only under strict conditions. She had to officially recognize Henry as the rightful king of England, and she had to renounce any claim she might hold to the English throne as Richard's widow. From Henry's point of view, this proposal was brilliant. Politically, it accomplished everything he needed. It removed Isabella from England without making her a martyr or symbol of resistance. It cleared the way for him to reframe the past, positioning himself as the only legitimate monarch, with no lingering ties to Richard's reign. And it sent a signal to both France and his own nobles that the transition of power was complete, uncontested, and settled on his terms. In just a few lines of parchment, Henry's advisors had designed a move that neutralized a potential threat and strengthened his grip on the crown. But for Isabella, the meaning was far more personal and far more painful. If Isabella agreed to leave England, it would mean more than just going home. It would mean quietly accepting that her marriage to Richard had ended the moment he lost his crown. Without needing to formally annul anything, Henry would be free from the commitments outlined in the original peace treaty, and he could avoid the scandal of publicly expelling a child queen. It was a clever solution, clean, quiet, and politically useful. But for Isabella, the choice was devastating. She was just 10 years old, and yet she was being asked to make a decision with massive consequences, not just for her own life, but for the fragile relationship between England and France. Her French advisors were split. Some believed she should accept the deal. It would get her out of England safely and back to her father's court in Paris, where she could be properly cared for. In time, they said, she could find another royal match and begin a new chapter of her life. But others pushed back. To them, Isabella was still Queen of England, Richard's widow, legally and morally. They argued that accepting Henry's terms would be surrendering not just her crown, but her dignity. It would be betraying Richard's memory and effectively declaring that his reign and their marriage meant nothing. Isabella wrestled with the choice for weeks. Part of her missed France deeply. She longed to see her family, to leave behind the uncertainty and cold formality of Henry's court, where she was watched more than welcomed. But another part of her couldn't ignore what this decision would represent. To agree to Henry's demands would be to admit defeat. It would be to abandon the peace that Richard had tried so hard to build, and perhaps had died defending. It was an impossible decision, and it had been placed on the shoulders of a 10-year-old girl. In the end, Isabella's choice was taken out of her hands by events far beyond her control. During one of his rare lucid periods, her father, King Charles VI of France, sent a clear message. He expected his daughter to return home immediately. The communication, delivered through official diplomatic channels, left no room for negotiation. If Henry's government continued to delay or dispute Isabella's return, France would treat it as an act of hostility, a serious threat that neither side could afford to ignore. Faced with the possibility of renewed war with France, Henry's court quickly agreed to send Isabella home. The exact terms of her release were intentionally vague, giving both kingdoms room to shape the story to fit their needs. In England, her return could be described as voluntary. In France, it could be framed as a rescue. The truth, like most things in politics, lay somewhere in between. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was filled with conflicting emotions for Isabella. She was leaving behind what had become in many ways her true home for the past 5 years, the palace apartments where she had learned to read English poetry, the gardens where she played with Margaret Holland, the grand hall where she had once been crowned Queen of England. At the same time, she was returning to a country that felt unfamiliar, even though it was the land of her birth. Her language, once perfect, now carried a slight English accent. Her clothes were English in style, her manners more shaped by Westminster than Paris. She had to relearn the customs of her father's court. The little girl who had left at 6 was returning as an 11-year-old young woman, marked by experiences that her French family couldn't fully understand. The reunion with her parents was anything but simple. Her father, Charles VI, was in the grip of one of his worst episodes when she arrived, raving about invisible enemies, refusing to recognize even his closest relatives. He didn't seem to know who Isabella was. Weeks later, when he emerged from his madness, he looked at her with confusion, as though he had forgotten her marriage altogether. Her mother, Queen Isabel of Bavaria, was more emotionally present, but also highly strategic. She welcomed Isabella warmly, yes, but almost immediately began to consider how her daughter's unusual political status could be used to serve France's interests. As the widow of an English king, Isabella still held a degree of diplomatic value. She had first-hand knowledge of the English court, its customs, its politics, even its military. In her mother's eyes, that made Isabella not just a grieving child, but a valuable political asset. Caught between two identities, Isabella struggled. She was French by birth, now back on French soil. But she had also been Queen of England, and part of her still felt tied, in duty, in memory, to the country she had left behind. When Isabella's mother's advisors began questioning her about England's defenses and Henry's support among the English nobility, she answered cautiously. She gave only broad, non-sensitive information, careful not to share anything that could be used for military planning or to escalate tensions. Her loyalty was to France, but not at the cost of her own conscience. The months that followed her return to France were filled with adjustment and reflection. At just 11 years old, Isabella was no longer a child, yet she wasn't quite a woman. Still, she had already lived through more political turmoil and emotional loss than most people would face in a lifetime. The question now was, What future awaited her in Europe's ruthless world of dynastic politics? Her status as the former Queen of England made her a high-profile marriage prospect, but it also complicated things. Some noble families saw her royal background and political history as intimidating. Others were more interested in what marrying her could do for their ambitions rather than in Isabella herself. Isabella, however, was no longer a naive child. Her marriage to Richard II had taught her hard lessons. She understood that political unions could bring safety and prestige, but they could also collapse overnight when alliances shifted. If she were to marry again, it wouldn't be as a pawn, but as a partner. Her future husband, she believed, would need to respect her as a thinking, capable young woman, not just as a symbol or a tool of diplomacy. Life at the French court in 1401 was anything but peaceful, especially for someone like Isabella, whose loyalties were not easily categorized. The war with England was still raging, and anti-English sentiment ran high among the French nobility. Isabella's years spent as England's queen made some courtiers regard her with mistrust. Even though she had returned to France at her father's command, she had to walk a delicate line, not appearing too friendly toward England, while still holding on to the fond memories and personal connections she had formed during her years there. Her affection for Richard and his court wasn't something she could simply erase, even if she never said it aloud. To make matters more difficult, her father's mental illness meant that France's government was fractured, controlled not by a single monarch, but by rival factions of powerful nobles. Each group saw Isabella as a potential asset, and she knew it. She had to remain neutral, careful not to get caught up in anyone's scheme or become a pawn in a dangerous power game. Her mother, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, was both a source of protection and a potential threat. She clearly loved her daughter and wanted her to be safe and secure. But Isabeau was also a shrewd political player, and she saw in Isabella's unusual background a strategic advantage. Her daughter had been raised in England, knew the inner workings of the enemy's court, and still held a degree of diplomatic status as Richard's widow. Isabeau's help came with strings attached. She expected Isabella to serve France's interests, even when those expectations went against her daughter's personal wishes, instincts, or moral compass. In 1402, Isabella's life took another complicated turn when news arrived from across the Channel. Henry IV was facing major unrest in England. His rule, still relatively new, was already being challenged. The powerful Percy family, once his allies, had turned against him. At the same time, uprisings were erupting in Wales and Scotland. The atmosphere in the French court shifted immediately. Some began to argue that now was the perfect time to strike, perhaps even invade England. There was open talk of restoring the rightful line to the English throne, and several nobles believed Isabella could play a key role. As the widow of the last Plantagenet king, she could serve as a symbol of legitimacy for a new regime. But Isabella was deeply disturbed by this idea. She didn't care for Henry IV's seizure of the crown, and she had no illusions about English politics. But she also had no desire to see England plunged into civil war. The people she remembered from her time there, her tutors, her servants, her childhood companions, were not guilty of the crimes of their rulers. The thought of French soldiers burning English villages in her name made her stomach turn. When she was asked directly for her opinion on the matter, she responded with quiet courage and restraint. She warned that an invasion would not be simple, that English resistance would be fierce, regardless of how people felt about Henry. England, she reminded them, had strong natural defenses, a long military tradition, and a deep pride that would likely turn even Henry's critics into defenders of their homeland. Her caution didn't sit well with the hardliners at court. Some accused her of divided loyalties, of having grown too fond of the English during her years as their queen. But others, particularly the more moderate voices, supported her. They argued that peace would serve France far better than a costly and uncertain war. Then, in 1403, just as political tensions were reaching their peak, Isabella received a proposal that would once again reshape her future. She was approached by envoys representing Charles, Duke of Orleans, one of the most powerful and ambitious noblemen in France. They brought an offer of marriage, an alliance that could re-establish Isabella's place in high politics, this time not as a queen in a foreign land, but as a French duchess with real influence at court. Charles, Duke of Orleans, was more than just a powerful noble. He was Isabella's cousin, the son of her father's brother, and one of the most influential figures in France. At 29, he was the exact same age Richard II had been when he first married Isabella. But this time, the age difference didn't seem so unsettling. Isabella was nearly 14, no longer a child, but a young woman on the verge of adulthood. From a political point of view, the match made perfect sense. It would keep Isabella securely within the French royal family, blocking the possibility that some foreign ruler might try to use her as a pawn in their own diplomatic games. It would also tie her to one of the most elegant and respected courts in Europe. Charles of Orleans wasn't just a political figure. He was known as a lover of poetry, a patron of the arts, and a man of both intellect and military experience. For Isabella, the proposal held personal appeal as well. This wouldn't be a cold marriage arranged for treaties or peace talks. It had the potential to be a partnership based on shared respect. She had met Charles several times when she was younger, and he had always treated her with genuine warmth and courtesy. He wasn't looking for a child to mold. He was old enough, experienced enough to be a true equal. But this marriage wasn't just about romance or family ties. It was happening at a time when England was in deep turmoil. Henry IV's rule was unstable, with rebellions, uprisings, and growing resistance among the English nobility. Some in France believed it was only a matter of time before Henry would fall. If that happened, Isabella might suddenly become valuable again. As the widow of the last rightful king of England, she could be called back to lend legitimacy to a new regime. That possibility made her remarriage especially urgent from the perspective of French diplomacy. Charles of Orleans understood the situation perfectly. He knew that marrying Isabella could serve both of their interests, but he also realized that the timing had to be just right. Too soon, and it might look like France was trying to erase her past. Too late, and someone else might try to claim her for political gain. The marriage, if it happened, would be more than a family affair. It would be a move on the chessboard of European power. one that could shape the future of both France and England, and finally allow Isabella to reclaim some control over her own destiny. Charles d'Orléans was not simply seeking a wife. He was considering a partnership with a woman who, under the right political circumstances, might one day be called upon to re-enter the world of English politics. This possibility gave their courtship a weight and intensity that was unusual even by the complex standards of medieval dynastic marriage. When Isabella first sat down with Charles to speak openly about their proposed union, she was immediately struck by how different he was from Richard II. Richard had been kind, even tender, but often distant, lost in his own thoughts, surrounded by books and art, yet somehow always apart from the world he ruled. Charles was the opposite. He was passionate, deeply engaged, and intensely aware of the shifting tides of politics, art, and war. And most of all, he spoke to her not as a symbol or a possession, but as a woman whose opinions mattered. "I want you to understand something," Charles told her during one of their private meetings. "I am not asking to marry the former Queen of England. I am asking to marry Isabella of Valois, the woman who lived through 2 courts, 2 kingdoms, and still holds her head high." For the first time in her life, Isabella felt genuinely seen. At 14, she was no longer the child bride of a treaty. She was a young woman with her own sense of self, her own memories, and her own emerging desires. She found herself drawn to Charles, not just because he was handsome and cultured, but because he respected her. He recognized her as someone shaped by experience, not broken by it. Once both sides agreed to the match, the formal negotiations moved quickly. Isabella would bring to the marriage her unique status as a former queen and her still potent web of political connections in both France and England. In retour, Charles vous offre à protection, statut et sécurité, shelter des penjoiries temps et politique, et peut-être, pour une fois, l'occasion à une vie privée vécue avec dignité et affection. Leur mariage, versé en juin de 1406 à Paris, était délibérément conçu pour contraster persécuté à la cérémonie Isabella de son premier mariage. Ce n'était pas un truc bâticile, était vivante, des célestes, belge, dimanche que de délibéré et festival. Strength et renouvelle. Maintenant, 16 ans, Isabella va assise dans la grande terre en bois de cyc profond, embriquée avec d'or de lys. Sa longue cheveux couronnés au cercle de saphir et perles se décomposait au grand public, sa foule détestée aux tendres auditions. C'est toute une jeune femme à effectuer exil et misère, et betrayau et émerger de sa dignité tout entière. At the altar, Charles waited, dressed in his finest ceremonial robes, his expression not one of diplomatic triumph, but of quiet joy. When their eyes met, there was something unmistakable between them, not just alliance, but affection. And when they exchanged vows, it was not only a political union, but the beginning of a partnership that Isabella had chosen for herself. When they exchanged their vows, their voices rang out clearly in the echoing nave of Notre Dame. Steady and composed, courtiers and foreign envoys alike noted that they looked directly at one another, not as strangers bound by politics, but as 2 people choosing to walk forward together. This was no cold alliance sealed by proxy and ceremony. It was something warmer, more human. something that, by medieval standards, approached genuine consent. The wedding feast that followed was a lavish display of French culture, confidence, and splendor. Troubadours sang newly composed ballads in honor of the young couple, their lyrics weaving Isabella's sorrowful past into a hopeful new beginning. There were masks and pageants depicting the triumph of love over war, loyalty over betrayal. The long banquet tables groaned under the weight of roasted game, sugared fruits, and steaming pies, and the finest wines from Gascony and Burgundy flowed like rivers. For the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to truly relax. The weight of diplomatic expectation, of childhood grief and foreign captivity seemed to lift. She laughed without looking over her shoulder. She danced without fear of making a misstep. Here, surrounded by family, friends, and admirers, Isabella felt something she hadn't felt since she was 6 years old, a sense of belonging. The French court, once skeptical of her, had come to embrace her not as a failed diplomatic experiment or tragic widow, but as a woman of strength and insight, someone who had returned not diminished by her ordeal in England, but tempered by it. She was no longer merely the daughter of a mad king or the child queen of a deposed monarch. She had become a stateswoman in her own right, and her new life with Charles offered her the freedom to grow into that role. The early years of her marriage to Charles of Orleans were, by every account, the happiest of her life. Charles was not only a loving husband, but also an intellectual companion. He shared her love of literature, music, philosophy, and art. His court at Blois, nestled on the banks of the Loire, became a magnet for poets, scholars, painters, and thinkers. Isabella thrived in this rich environment. She took on her new responsibilities with eagerness and purpose. She patronized poets and musicians. She commissioned illuminated manuscripts and opened a scriptorium, where monks carefully copied and preserved classical and religious texts. She maintained correspondence with learned men and women across Europe. Some remembered her as a queen with a scholar's soul. Her years in England had taught her much: the fragility of power, the nuances of diplomacy, the cruelty of politics, but also the value of culture and education in times of unrest. She brought this hard-won wisdom into her new life, becoming a bridge between kingdoms, a champion of peaceful exchange, and a quietly influential figure in the intellectual life of France. And now, with Charles at her side, she began to speak not just as a noblewoman, but with a voice of her own. Charles valued her insights into English affairs, but more importantly, he respected her judgment across a wide range of issues affecting their duchy and the French kingdom as a whole. Isabella was no longer a symbolic bride or pawn of statecraft. She had become a true partner in governance, offering counsel not out of obligation, but from lived experience and thoughtful reflection. Her presence at court was not just tolerated, but sought after. Their partnership deepened with the birth of their first child, a daughter named Jeanne, in 1407. Motherhood transformed Isabella in quiet but profound ways. She approached it with the same intensity and care that had defined every chapter of her life. Determined to break the cycle of detachment and court politics that had shaped her own childhood, she made a radical choice for a woman of her station. She insisted on nursing Jean herself. Court physicians and noblewomen protested, claiming it was undignified for a duchess. But Isabella refused to yield. She held her daughter to her breast, not just with affection, but with purpose, a vow unspoken whispered instead in soft French and careful English. "You will have what I never had. Love without fear. A home without politics, choices." To baby, born healthy and strong, became the radiant center of her world. And Charles, too, proved to be a devoted father. Despite the demands of his position, Isabella often found him in the nursery, reading aloud from illuminated manuscripts, or simply sitting in silence, watching Jean sleep, with a reverence that moved Isabella to tears. In those moments, she saw not just a husband or a duke, but a man who truly understood the fragile beauty of peace. But peace, as always, was fleeting. While Isabella basked in her domestic joy, the outside world continued to fracture. In England, Henry IV's reign remained troubled. Rebellions still flared in the north and in Wales. Whispers reached France that Henry was unwell, and that tensions between his sons were already forming. Isabella listened to these reports with the calm of someone who understood how quickly dynasties could fall. More immediate, however, was the storm brewing within France itself. Her father, King Charles VI, was slipping further into madness. His absences were growing longer and more violent, leaving a vacuum at the very center of royal authority. Into this void stepped the ambitious and the ruthless, each claiming the right to rule in the king's name. At the center of this unfolding crisis were two men, Louis, Duke of Orleans, Isabella's father-in-law, and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Louis, as the king's brother, believed himself the natural regent during Charles VI's incapacities. He was elegant, charismatic, and known for his taste in art and luxury. But he was also ambitious, dangerously so. John of Burgundy, by contrast, was stern, calculating, and grounded in military power. He had no patience for Louis's courtly extravagance and was determined to position himself as the protector of the French realm. The rivalry between these two men, both powerful, both related to the king, would eventually plunge France into civil war. But in these early years of Isabella's second marriage, the conflict still seemed distant. Another court feud, another political squabble among nobles. Isabella chose not to engage. She focused on raising her daughter, nurturing the cultural revival of Blois, and supporting Charles in his quieter efforts to stabilize the kingdom through diplomacy and patronage. She had lived through enough of other people's wars. But soon, the war would come to her. This comfortable neutrality became impossible to maintain in November 1407, when Louis, Duke of Orleans, was assassinated on the streets of Paris by agents of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The murder was carried out with breathtaking boldness, a brutal ambush in broad daylight, the king's own brother hacked to death just steps from the royal palace. His attackers vanished into the twisting alleys of medieval Paris, their escape made easier by the complicity or cowardice of onlookers. The assassination shattered the fragile balance at the French court and transformed Isabella's life overnight. Her husband, Charles of Orleans, suddenly inherited not only his father's titles and responsibilities, but also his enemies. Still in his early 20s, he found himself thrust into the role of political leader in a divided kingdom and at the heart of a deadly blood feud. The Burgundians had made their intentions unmistakably clear. Anyone in the House of Orleans was fair game. Isabella, once a patron of the arts and a nurturer of courtly peace, was now the wife of a marked man. Her world narrowed into one of bodyguards, locked gates, and whispered warnings. She could no longer ride through the countryside or visit monasteries without military escort. Her letters were intercepted before leaving her chambers. Her servants replaced by those loyal to the Armagnac faction. The once refined atmosphere of their court at Blois, a haven of poetry, music, and scholarly debate, curdled into tension and suspicion. The corridors that once echoed with lute music and laughter now carried the click of armored boots and the low voices of men planning war. Charles himself began to change. The gentle, intellectual young man Isabella had fallen in love with hardened before her eyes. Grief turned to rage. He threw himself into vengeance with a fervor that sometimes frightened her. Speaking of retribution, not just in strategic terms, but with the righteous passion of a man who believed himself chosen to restore honor through blood. He began forging alliances with other nobles opposed to Burgundy, slowly building what would become the Armagnac faction, named after one of his strongest supporters, Bernard VII of Armagnac, his father-in-law through a later marriage. Isabella supported him because she believed in justice, but she feared the cost. She had seen what dynastic violence could do to a kingdom. She had watched England tear itself apart under Richard and Henry. Now she feared. France stood on the same precipice. Her premonitions proved tragically accurate. The civil war between the Orléans Armagnacs and Burgundians escalated with horrifying speed, pulling more nobles into its orbit, each faction accusing the other of treason, corruption, and sacrilege. The country began to fracture, not just politically, but socially and spiritually. Yet, in the midst of this grim chapter, there came a moment of light. In 1408, Isabella gave birth to their second child, a son named Charles, after both his father and grandfather. The birth was more than a personal joy. It was a symbol of continuity in the face of chaos, a moment of hope for a family reeling from trauma. Holding her newborn son, Isabella felt a flicker of the old peace she had known as a younger bride, before murders in the streets, before whispered conspiracies, before France began to bleed itself dry. But even that joy could not fully silence the drumbeat of war outside their gates. The arrival of a male heir in 1408 strengthened the Orleans claim to eventual leadership of France, but it also made Isabella's household a more dangerous symbol, a more tempting target for the Burgundian faction. A child who might one day claim royal authority was both an asset and a liability in a kingdom fractured by civil war. Isabella felt the weight of that duality every time she looked at her son. She named him Charles in honor of both his father and grandfather, and approached his upbringing with the same fierce devotion and clarity of purpose that had guided her through every trial since leaving England. But this time, the stakes were even higher. She was not just raising a child, she was raising a potential future leader, one who would need to walk a treacherous path through a world where love, loyalty, and lineage were as dangerous as any sword. Her lessons for young Charles began early. He was taught to bow to the chapel altar before he could even pronounce the prayers, and to recite the names of his ancestors before he understood what legacy meant. But Isabella was determined that her son would not become a pawn of vengeance or a creature of courtly cynicism. She wanted him to grow into a man of honor, grace, and resilience, one who understood both the burden and the beauty of of nobility. She insisted on being involved in every aspect of his education. His tutors were personally selected by Isabella, not just for their knowledge, but for their character. She crafted his curriculum herself, blending classical texts with chronicles of recent history, especially the fall of Richard II and the wars of England, events she had lived through. She wanted Charles to learn from the mistakes of kings, to see how pride, rashness, and cruelty could destroy dynasties. Languages were essential. He learned Latin, French, English, and Italian, each taught not only as a tool of diplomacy, but as a gateway into other cultures. Isabella would sometimes sit with him during his lessons, offering corrections and encouragement, challenging him to translate passages from Roman historians or recite speeches of famous rulers. More than anything, she taught him how to listen, how to weigh what people said against what they meant, how to read silences, and how to distinguish truth from flattery. These were the survival skills of a royal child in a fractured court. As Charles of Orleans was drawn deeper into the conflict, commanding troops and leading campaigns, Isabella's role changed again. No longer simply a duchess or cultural patron, she became the de facto administrator of the Orleans estates, a wartime regent in all but name. From Blois, she managed the territories of the House of Orleans with a skill that surprised even her enemies. She organized supply lines, dispatched emissaries, raised funds, and negotiated loyalties among wavering vassals. She had learned in England how thin the line was between diplomacy and survival, and now she used every tool at her disposal to sustain her husband's cause without plunging their people into despair. Her correspondence during this period, preserved in fragments, reveals a sharp, eloquent voice, equally capable of poetic lament and cold political calculation. In one letter to a wavering ally, she wrote, "You ask if we have hope. I answer, we have duty. Hope is a luxury, but duty is the price of our blood. Stand with us not for what may come, but for what we owe to those not yet born." Even in the face of raids, betrayals, and endless rumors of defeat, Isabella never allowed herself to become cynical. Her court remained a place of learning and beauty, not in defiance of war, but as an answer to it. And in the quiet hours, when her children were asleep and her secretaries dismissed, she would walk alone in the corridors of the chateau, haunted not just by memories of England and Richard, but by a new question. Could a woman who had survived 2 kingdoms worth of violence raise a child strong enough to end the cycle? Her letters from this period reveal a striking transformation, not simply in tone, but in authority. Gone was the uncertain girl once passed between courts and crowns like a political token. In her place stood a woman who had not only embraced her role as a duchess, but had grown into a genuine political leader, determined to shape events rather than merely endure them. The war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions was devastating to France. Towns were burned, harvests destroyed, and roads became impassable due to roving bands of mercenaries and deserters. Commerce collapsed, and the peasantry, already battered by plague, taxation, and famine, bore the brunt of the violence. Soldiers from both sides looted indiscriminately. Loyalty to crown or cause meant little to those starving in the countryside. Amid this chaos, Isabella became a quiet force of stability. From her estates in Blois, she organized relief caravans, personally funded charitable foundations, and negotiated local truces that allowed food and medicine to reach besieged towns. She petitioned the crown to spare monasteries that served as hospitals and safe havens. When refugees appeared at her gates, many of them women and children, Isabella saw not threats but responsibilities. She opened storehouses. She wrote letters of protection. She had once been a child caught in the gears of power. She would not let others suffer the same fate if she could prevent it. By 1409, Isabella was known throughout France not only as the Duchess of Orléans, but as La Dame de la Miséricorde, the Lady of Mercy. Her ability to combine nobility with compassion, authority with empathy, gave her a moral authority that would prove essential as the kingdom slid further into disarray. That same year brought the birth of her third child, a daughter named Marguerite. The joy of her birth was shadowed by fear. Isabella, now 20, had already endured 2 pregnancies, and her body, though strong, had not been spared. She had suffered fevers after her second child, and now the court physicians, though cautious in their assessments, privately expressed concerns. Isabella faced this danger with clear-eyed realism. She wrote detailed instructions regarding her children's guardianship, their education, and their inheritance. She composed personal letters to be opened by each child should she not survive. In one, addressed to her eldest daughter Jeanne, she wrote, "Be more than good. Be wise. A noble woman's virtue is not measured only by her purity, but by her strength, her judgment, and her ability to protect those who depend on her." Her fears proved tragically prescient. Marguerite's birth was difficult and nearly fatal. The labor lasted more than 2 days, and when the child was finally delivered, Isabella collapsed from blood loss and infection. For several harrowing days, she hovered between life and death, her skin pale as ivory, her breath shallow and rasping. Charles refused to leave her side, taking her hand even when she was unconscious, whispering poetry to her in the hope that some part of her still listened. Messengers were dispatched across France and into Burgundy and England, asking for prayers. Cathedrals held vigils, nuns offered masses, and slowly, against all odds, Isabella recovered. The experience changed them both. For Charles, it was a reminder of how fragile love could be in a world so easily torn apart by power and pride. For Isabella, it deepened her understanding of mortality, motherhood, and legacy. She had faced death and returned with a renewed determination to protect the life she had fought so hard to build, for her children, her people, and herself. As she convalesced, Isabella began dictating a series of essays and letters, many of which survive today in fragments. In one, she wrote, "To rule is not only to hold power, but to answer for what is done in your name. If you cannot hear the cry of the widow, or see the hunger in the eyes of the poor, then you are not a ruler, but a tyrant dressed in velvet." By the time she was strong enough to walk again, Isabella was no longer just a duchess. She was a symbol of endurance, of principled leadership, and of a woman who had risen from the ashes of one kingdom to help hold another together. Lutte sustain, yet even as her body weakened, Isabella's mind remained sharp and her will unbroken. She continued to oversee correspondence, manage affairs of state in Charles's absence, and host foreign envoys from courts as far away as Aragon and the Holy Roman Empire. Her apartments at Blois became a quiet center of diplomacy, a place where alliances were shaped not with swords, but with carefully chosen words, shared confidences, and a clarity of vision that few other nobles could match. Those closest to her began to speak of her not just as a duchess, or former queen, but as a kind of living conscience of the realm. She had endured the collapse of one kingdom and helped hold another together, not by commanding armies, but by understanding people. Her resilience, combined with her sense of justice and long memory, gave her a quiet authority that even hardened generals and cynical courtiers found difficult to dismiss. Yet the strain was undeniable. By the winter of 1412, Isabella could no longer climb stairs without gasping for breath. Her attendants often found her sitting motionless by the fire, eyes closed, her fingers curled around the letters and ledgers she refused to abandon. Charles grew increasingly concerned and began spending more time at her side, foregoing campaigns when he could, delegating his responsibilities so he could be with her. In their last months together, their relationship deepened into something more profound than passion, a blend of reverence, gratitude, and shared history. They had built a life not in defiance of the world's cruelty, but in quiet defiance of its indifference. They had not been spared grief or hardship, but together they had created something worth preserving. In late March 1413, Isabella fell ill with what her physicians called a lung fever, most likely pneumonia. Despite every effort, her body, already so weakened, could not fight it. For several days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, often murmuring in both French and English, snatches of lullabies, fragments of prayers, names of children, names of kings. On April 7th, 1413, shortly after midnight, Isabella of Valois, Duchess of Orleans, and former Queen of England, died in her sleep at the age of just 21. France mourned her in a way it mourned few women. Even her enemies acknowledged her grace, her courage, and her rare gift for statesmanship. Charles ordered a week of mourning across their territories. The court poets composed elegies, and in England, even some of those who had once viewed her with suspicion found themselves quietly grieving the girl who had once been their queen and who had never wished them harm. She was buried in the Church of the Celestines in Paris beside her royal ancestors. But her legacy lived on in the children she had raised with such care, in the alliances she had helped preserve, and in the quiet example she had set, that dignity, intelligence, and compassion could survive even the harshest of times. Isabella began spending more and more time in quiet reflection and prayer, as if she sensed that her time might be running out. Even though her body was growing weaker, her mind stayed sharp. She stayed deeply involved with her family and continued to take her responsibilities seriously. She didn't step back from life. She still oversaw her children's education, managed her family's political affairs, and kept up with her cultural interests. Her strength and will to keep going, even while dealing with serious health problems, inspired everyone around her. In the spring of 1409, there was a brief moment of hope when early peace talks started between the Orléans and Burgundian factions. Isabella played an important part in these discussions. She brought her strong sense of diplomacy and her well-known fairness to the table, trying to help both sides find common ground. Although the negotiations didn't succeed in the end, Isabella's efforts didn't go unnoticed. People praised her involvement, and it boosted her reputation as someone who might help mediate future conflicts. Her ability to work with both sides showed how politically mature she was and how deeply she wanted to help bring peace to France. But as the year 1409 moved forward, Isabella's health took a serious turn for the worse. The breathing problem she'd struggled with ever since Marguerite was born got more severe. She also began to show signs of a wasting illness that would eventually take her life. Doctors at the time didn't understand the disease, what we now know as tuberculosis, but they could see clearly that she was gravely ill. Isabella faced the idea of death with the same bravery she'd shown all her life. She took careful steps to make sure her children would be cared for and well educated, no matter what happened to her. She also made sure to protect her husband's political position, knowing that her death could give their enemies a chance to take advantage of the situation. In her final months, Isabella focused on preparing for death while treasuring the time she still had with her loved ones. She was determined to keep up with her daily routines for as long as her body allowed, refusing to become a burden. She faced her illness with such courage that it became the stuff of legend. Her strength inspired stories and songs that would be passed down for generations. Isabella of Valois died on September 1409, at just 20 years old. In her short life, she had lived across 3 kingdoms and gone through 2 royal marriages. She had known both the heights of royal influence and the uncertainty of political chaos. Her death was deeply mourned, not only by her family and people, but also by many across Europe who admired her kindness and wisdom. The funeral procession that carried Isabella's body to her final resting place at the Celestine Convent in Paris was one of the largest ever seen in medieval France. Delegations came from all over Europe to honor a woman who had represented the difficult balance between personal courage and political responsibility in a troubled era. Charles of Orleans was heartbroken. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost his closest confidant, advisor, and political partner. Though the grieving widower would eventually remarry, he never stopped cherishing Isabella or the joy they had shared in their short time together. Isabella's children went on to have lasting influence in French and European affairs. Her son, Charles, became a respected poet and supporter of the arts. Her daughters married into powerful families, securing political alliances that helped solidify the Orleans family's strength. Each of them carried with them the values their mother had taught: bravery, empathy, and a belief in using their privileges to help others. The impact of Isabella's death went far beyond her household. Her absence left a major gap in France's political landscape. Without her calming influence, the civil war between the Orleans and Burgundian factions grew even more hostile and destructive, pushing the kingdom deeper into chaos. The peace Isabella had worked so hard to bring about remained out of reach. France continued to suffer from internal conflict and political division for many years after her death. But Isabella's legacy went far beyond the immediate fallout of those struggles. She proved that even in a time when women were expected to stay silent and serve as pawns in political games, one determined person could still find room to act independently and lead with both heart and principle. Her story became a beacon of hope for other women who faced similar barriers. In fact, generations of female leaders and political figures would later point to Isabella's strength and intelligence as inspiration to challenge the limits placed on women in public life. Modern historians sometimes wrestle with how to talk about Isabella. On one hand, they admire her achievements. On the other, they struggle with the uncomfortable facts of her early life. The idea of a 6-year-old girl being married to a 29-year-old man clashes sharply with today's values, especially regarding childhood and consent, even if we recognize that such marriages were often seen as political necessities back then. But trying to measure Isabella's world by modern standards risks missing what truly matters in her story. She was born into a system that viewed royal children as tools for diplomacy, and yet she managed to rise above that role. She built a life that was meaningful, purposeful, and deeply human. Though her marriages may have begun as political arrangements, they grew into genuine partnerships, marked by respect and affection. And the violence and instability of her time weren't caused by personal failings, but by a brutal world where power and survival were always at stake. What makes Isabella's story so remarkable is how she handled those challenges with dignity, compassion, and a moral clarity that was rare even among kings and generals. Her life reminds us that history isn't just about wars, treaties, or changing borders. It's also about the people who lived through those events and made choices that shaped them. Isabella of Valois refused to let her life be defined by the circumstances she was born into. And by doing so, she left behind a legacy that reached far beyond the politics of her time. Looking back, we see in her story both the hard limits people face and the powerful ways they can still rise above them. She lived within the limits set by her era and by her role as a woman, but that didn't stop her from finding ways to act on her own terms and leave a real mark on the world around her. At its heart, Isabella's story is one of strength, clear thinking, and a deep belief that personal happiness and political duty don't have to cancel each other out. The medieval world that shaped Isabella of Valois was brutal in ways that are hard for us to fully grasp today. Life expectancy was low, childhood passed in a blink, and political deals were often made at the cost of human lives. But even in such a harsh setting, Isabella and others like her still managed to bring moments of grace into that world. They showed kindness, nurtured relationships, and brought meaning into their lives despite everything working against them. Isabella's legacy isn't one of helplessness. It's a story of strength, of rising above challenges that would have broken many others. Her life is proof that even under pressure, a strong spirit can find ways to endure, to grow, and to lead. In the end, Isabella's story reminds us that every era has its own difficult questions and moral gray areas. And while the people of the past may have lived differently, they still shared the same basic needs we all do: for love, safety, and purpose. To truly understand Isabella's life is to understand something deeply human. We are all shaped by the time we live in, but we also have the power to rise beyond its limitations.